Hello and welcome back to the Armory. The topic of today's lesson is the great and dreadful day of the Lord, discussed in Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5. We've already proven in the first video that this wasn't referring to the second coming because, one, it was specifically written to Israel from Malachi chapter 1 and verse 1, and in Malachi chapter 4 and verse 4, we saw that they had to remember the law of Moses, a law that was nailed to the cross. And so we want to describe today what the great and dreadful day of the Lord means. And we've all already proven that end of the world language doesn't necessarily mean end of the world. It usually means a national judgment. So what does the great and dreadful day of the Lord mean in Malachi chapter 4? Well, it refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. Led by Titus of Rome, and we'll bring out a few points that proves that this is the case. If you look in the Old Testament, the day of the Lord phrase never refers to the end of the world. It usually refers to some sort of national judgment that happens within time itself. If you look in Isaiah chapter 2 and verses 10 through 22, this day of the Lord refers to destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. If you look in Isaiah chapter 13 and verses 1 through 22, this day of the Lord refers to a judgment upon Babylon. If you look in Jeremiah chapter 46 and verses 1 through 10, the day of the Lord mentioned there refers to destruction of the Gentile nations that surrounded the nation of Israel. And so as we think about this point, the day of the Lord uttered in Malachi chapter 4 is also referring to some sort of national judgment. If you look in the days of John the Baptist, Matthew chapter 3, John the Baptist warns of this judgment that is coming. He says in Matthew chapter 3, Pharisees and Sadducees, they come to his baptism, and he says to them, "O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" If you go on to verse 12, he says, "Whose fan is in his hand, he will thoroughly purge his floor and gather his wheat into the garner. But he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire." So John the Baptist warns of a judgment coming. Not end-time judgment, but end-time judgment. And so you look at some things that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24. The disciples are looking at the temple and how beautiful it is, and they go to show this to Jesus, and in verse 2 he says, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone that shall not be thrown down." And so he tells them that there is destruction coming to the temple. He goes on and says some things. He even mentions the abomination of desolation by Daniel, and he goes on and keeps saying something about the Son of Man appearing in heaven and the angels coming, and this looks like the end time. But if you look in verse 34, he says, "Verily I say unto you, this generation," that is the generation that he's speaking to, "shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." And so Jesus warns of the destruction of Jerusalem coming very soon to their future. He calls this the days of vengeance. If you look in Luke chapter 21, he starts in verse 20 and he says, "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck, and in those days, for these shall be in great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." If you look at history, about 40 years later after Jesus spoke this, Titus came in with the Romans and destroyed nearly 1 million Jews in the destruction of Jerusalem. And my friends, that is great, and that is dreadful. That is a very dreadful day, and it was probably one of the worst destructions that ever happened to Jerusalem. And so Malachi 4 in verse 5 and 6 refers to John the Baptist coming before the destruction of Jerusalem. Thank you very much for being with us today. And if you have any questions or any comments that you would like to make, please feel free to email us at lukegoulds92@gmail.com. We'd be happy to answer any questions and help you see more of the truths that are found in the Word of God.